Billionaire Wesley Foster sat alone in his penthouse, dinner untouched, when the news broke onto his screen. A black single father was being dragged out of his own home, live, in front of the entire city. Marcus Reed stood in the snow, one arm around his son, the other shielding his daughter's eyes from the pile of furniture dumped onto the sidewalk. Then his daughter asked the reporter's microphone a question that was never meant for cameras. "Daddy, what did we do wrong?" Wesley's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Behind the reporter, spray painted across the brick, was an address he recognized instantly. 1847 Kensington Avenue. His building. If stories like this hit you right in the chest, hit subscribe before we keep going. You're not going to want to miss where this one ends up. The fork stayed suspended in Wesley's hand for a long moment before he set it down completely untouched. He reached for the remote and turned up the volume, as if a louder version of the same nightmare might somehow make more sense. The reporter kept talking about a routine eviction, using words like standard procedure and unpaid balance, while behind her a man stood perfectly still in the falling snow, absorbing the cold so his children wouldn't have to. Wesley Foster ran an empire most people would kill for. Foster Meridian Properties controlled more than 14,000 apartments spread across 6 cities, a portfolio worth $2.6 billion. Built on spreadsheets he reviewed every morning before the sun came up. He knew occupancy rates down to the decimal. He knew average collection times, average vacancy turnover, average everything. What he did not know, what he had never once needed to know in nearly 2 decades of running this company, was what any of his tenants actually looked like standing on a sidewalk with nowhere left to go. His father used to say that the moment you saw a tenant instead of a contract, you stopped being a businessman and started being a liability. Aldridge Foster had drilled that lesson into him before Wesley was even old enough to understand what a lease was, and for years Wesley had lived by it without question. Numbers didn't cry. Numbers didn't ask questions you couldn't answer. Numbers just told you whether something was working, and by every measure that mattered, building number 1847 Kensington Avenue was working exactly as it should. He had signed off on that building's quarterly report only hours earlier, calling it one of the strongest performing assets in the entire portfolio. High occupancy, reliable collections, minimal turnover cost. The report never mentioned broken locks or a heating system that failed every winter, because the report had never been built to measure things like that. It measured revenue per unit, and nothing else, and Wesley had never once stopped to wonder what the revenue was quietly costing the people living inside those walls. Now that same address sat behind a reporter's shoulder, spelled out in white letters against red brick, while a father did the only thing he could do for his children in that moment, which was stand between them and the cameras. The man's name, according to the ticker running along the bottom of the screen, was Marcus Reed. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't resisting. He was simply trying to keep 2 small faces turned away from a city that had decided to watch. His daughter's voice carried anyway, thin and confused, cutting straight through the reporter's commentary. "Daddy, what did we do wrong?" Nobody answered her. Not the crew filming her family's belongings get thrown onto a growing pile of furniture. Not the 2 men in matching jackets checking their clipboards like this was any other Tuesday. And certainly not Wesley, sitting alone in a 14-person dining room built for guests who never came. He muted the television without meaning to, his thumb finding the button out of some old reflex to control what he couldn't stand to hear. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had. He looked around his own penthouse, at the wine cellar stocked with bottles he'd never opened, at rooms that existed purely to be photographed for magazines, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, none of it felt like an accomplishment. Wesley opened his laptop with hands that weren't quite steady, and pulled up the tenant management system for building 1847. He typed in the unit number visible faintly in one of the broadcast shots and waited, half hoping the records would somehow contradict what he'd just watched. They didn't. Marcus Reed had lived in Unit 312 for over 5 years, and in that time he had paid his rent on time 64 out of 66 months, a number so far above average that Wesley had to check it twice. The remaining details filled in like a slow accusation, an injury on the job, his right hand crushed between two pieces of machinery at the bus maintenance depot where he'd worked for 9 years. A workers' compensation claim still sitting unprocessed. 12 documented attempts to contact the property management company, every single one logged and every single one ignored. Internal notes describing him as uncooperative and confrontational, despite call recordings that, when Wesley finally played one, revealed nothing but a calm, exhausted man asking for a little more time. 6 weeks. That was the entire distance between a man with a 5-year record most landlords would frame and hang on a wall, and a man standing homeless in the snow with his children watching strangers throw their lives onto a sidewalk. Wesley sat with that number until it stopped feeling like data and started feeling like an indictment, not of Marcus Reed, but of every system Wesley had built to make sure a story like this could unfold without anyone ever having to look at it directly. His phone buzzed before he could process any of it further. His head of communications, Grace Whitfield, wanted to know if he'd seen the coverage and whether he wanted a statement drafted before the story picked up more traction online. Her message was efficient and calm, the way crisis messages always were, framing the entire situation as a Pinnacle Property Group matter that could be handled with a carefully worded apology and a quiet settlement check sent somewhere far from any camera. Wesley read the message twice and felt something in his chest tighten in a way spreadsheets had never managed to do. Grace wasn't wrong about how these things usually worked. Issue a statement, blame the management company for an isolated incident, offer compensation discreetly, and let the news cycle move on to something else within a week. It was the playbook his father had written, and it had never failed him before tonight. He typed a reply and deleted it twice before finally sending 3 words. "Give me time." Grace responded almost instantly asking how much time, and Wesley realized he didn't have an answer, because for once this wasn't a decision he could make from behind a desk in Chicago. He thought about calling his lawyers first, the way protocol demanded, but instead found himself pulling up flight availability to Philadelphia before he'd even decided to go. By the time his car pulled away from the building that night, Wesley had told no one where he was actually going. Not the board, not his legal team, not even Grace, who still believed this would be handled with a phone call and a check. He watched the city lights blur past the window and thought about the address burned into his memory now, 1847 Kensington Avenue, a building he had approved renovations for, approved rent increases for, approved eviction policies for, without ever once setting foot inside it. Somewhere over Ohio, staring at his own reflection in the dark airplane window, Wesley admitted to himself that the distance had never been an accident. It had been the entire point. He landed in Philadelphia a few hours later with nothing but a small bag and an address he already knew by heart. He told the driver to stop 2 blocks early, wanting to walk the rest of the way himself, though he couldn't fully explain why. The wind cut sharp against his face as he walked, snow crunching under shoes that had never touched pavement like this before. Ahead of him, the outline of the building came into view, unremarkable brick against a gray sky, nothing like the polished renderings in his quarterly reports. For the first time in his career, Wesley Foster reached out and pulled open the front door of a building that belonged to him, stepping across a threshold he had spent years avoiding. The door gave way easier than it should have, the lock mechanism loose and rattling in its frame as if it hadn't held properly in months. Wesley stepped into a lobby lit by a single working bulb, the others either burnt out or missing entirely, leaving most of the hallway in a gray half-darkness that made the peeling paint look worse than it probably was. He pressed the button for the elevator out of habit and waited, watching the indicator light stay dark no matter how many times he tried. A woman passing through the lobby with a cart of groceries told him without looking up that the elevator hadn't worked in over 3 months, and that everyone above the 3rd floor had simply learned to expect a long climb. She said it the way people say things they've stopped being angry about, and something about that resignation unsettled Wesley more than outrage would have. He climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, passing water stains spreading across the ceiling in shapes that told him this leak had been going on for a long time. The air grew colder as he climbed, and by the time he reached the 3rd floor landing he could see his own breath, faint but unmistakable in a building that was supposed to have a functioning heating system. He thought about the maintenance report he'd approved without reading closely, the one that listed heating repairs as completed months ago, and felt a slow, uncomfortable recognition settle into his chest. A woman stepped out of the apartment beside Unit 312, watching him with the kind of caution reserved for strangers who clearly didn't belong in a building like this. She introduced herself as Odessa Harmon, a retired seamstress who had lived on that floor for almost 11 years. When Wesley asked gently what she knew about the family who used to live next door, her expression shifted from suspicion into something closer to grief. She told him that Marcus wasn't just a good tenant, he was the reason half the building still functioned at all. When the building's own maintenance requests went unanswered for weeks at a time, it was Marcus who fixed the loose railing outside her door. Marcus who checked on her heating unit when it cut out overnight. Marcus who once spent an entire Saturday repairing another neighbor's wheelchair with parts he bought himself because the request to management had gone nowhere for over a month. He drove her to her cardiology appointments twice a month without ever once accepting gas money. They called him a troublemaker, Odessa said, her voice tightening around the word like it still offended her, because he wouldn't stay quiet while his kids slept in a room with no heat. She described the night Marcus had called the management office, demanding an explanation for why the hot water had been shut off for 3 straight days, a call that later appeared in his file as evidence of aggressive behavior. Wesley asked to hear it for himself, and by the end of that day, he had. The Pinnacle Property Group office sat 6 blocks away in a squat gray building that looked as unremarkable as every other regional office Wesley had ever walked past without entering. The branch manager, a nervous man named Curtis Doyle, seemed startled to find the CEO of Foster Meridian standing in his lobby unannounced. Curtis handed the folder over without argument, along with the audio recordings logged under the account. Wesley sat in a borrowed office and listened to the recording that had apparently justified labeling Marcus as difficult. The voice on the tape was steady, almost formal, asking only when someone might come look at the water heater and whether his children could expect hot water again before the weekend. There was no shouting, no threat, nothing that resembled the language used in his file. Each time he played it, he heard nothing but a father asking to be helped. When he asked Curtis why a call like that would ever be flagged as aggressive, the answer came without hesitation, almost defensive in its certainty. Every policy in that building, Curtis explained, from the automated fee schedule to the eviction timeline to the language used in tenant files, had been approved at the corporate level by Foster Meridian itself. Pinnacle wasn't improvising. They were executing a system exactly as designed, and Wesley realized the failure he was looking for wasn't hiding in some rogue manager's bad judgment. It was sitting in his own signature. He found Marcus later that evening in the basement of a church 3 streets over, a temporary shelter set up for families who had nowhere else to go on short notice. Nia sat against the wall, clutching a backpack stuffed with her brother's clothes, watching the room the way children watch things they don't yet understand but know they should be afraid of. Caleb was asleep across 2 folding chairs, one hand still wrapped around a small yellow toy bus with a wheel hanging loose. Marcus sat beside them, trying to fill out a job application with his left hand, his right arm still wrapped and clearly limited in its movement. Wesley introduced himself only as Wesley, offering help in the vaguest terms he could manage. Marcus looked up at him with an exhaustion that had clearly settled somewhere deep. "I don't need a rich man showing up here to feel better about himself," Marcus said, his voice flat rather than angry, which somehow made it land harder. "I need a job I can actually do with one working hand. I need a door that locks. And I need my kids to understand that this didn't happen because their father failed them." Wesley didn't answer right away, because there wasn't an answer that wouldn't have sounded hollow standing in a church basement in front of a sleeping 6-year-old. He came back the next day anyway, and the day after that, bringing clothes, food, and books without ever asking for gratitude in return. Nia remained distant at first, answering only in short sentences, but by the 3rd visit she had started speaking to him in full thoughts again, asking questions about Chicago and whether he had ever seen snow that deep before. Caleb showed him the broken toy bus on his 2nd visit, holding it up with the same hope he probably once held for adults in general, asking if Wesley knew how to fix it. Wesley didn't. He turned the small plastic wheel over in his hands, a man who controlled 14,000 apartments, unable to solve a problem, a hardware store clerk could have fixed in minutes. He handed it back to Caleb and told him he'd figure it out. The shift came without warning, on an evening when the small television mounted in the corner of the church basement switched from local news to a business segment covering Foster Meridian's quarterly earnings. Marcus looked up mid-sentence and saw Wesley's face fill the screen, calm and composed, discussing occupancy trends with an anchor who called him one of the city's most influential landlords. Marcus went still in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with understanding exactly who had been sitting beside his children for the past several days. When Wesley arrived the following afternoon, Marcus was waiting for him just inside the door, blocking the entrance with a calm that felt more dangerous than shouting ever could have. "You knew," Marcus said, not as a question. Wesley admitted that he had known from the very beginning, and Marcus absorbed that admission the way a man absorbs a blow he'd already been expecting, his jaw tightening but his voice staying level. "My whole life I've had to prove I wasn't the kind of father who walks away," Marcus said, each sentence measured and deliberate. "I went to work with a fever. I learned to braid my daughter's hair from videos at 2 in the morning. I sleep 4 hours a night so my kids don't feel like they're missing their mother. And all it took was your company writing uncooperative in a file, and the whole city watched me on television like I was the one who failed my own family." Marcus accused him directly of using this visit to ease his own guilt, his voice finally sharpening at the edges. "You break our home and then you show up with grocery bags," he said. "That's not repair. That's buying yourself a good night's sleep." Wesley absorbed the accusation without flinching away from it, because some part of him recognized there was truth buried inside the anger. It was Nia's voice that broke through the tension, small but clear, stepping between the two men with the directness only a child could manage. "Are you the one who told them to throw our things outside?" she asked, looking up at Wesley with an expression that expected an honest answer, not a careful one. Wesley opened his mouth and found nothing ready to say, the silence stretching long enough that the question itself seemed to hang in the air of the basement. That question rearranged something in him that no boardroom meeting or earnings call ever had. Fixing Marcus Reed's situation alone would not undo what had happened, and it would not answer what Nia was really asking, which was whether people like her father mattered to people like Wesley at all. Somewhere in his portfolio of 14,000 units, he suspected there were other children asking the exact same question, and no one had bothered to answer them either. The confrontation in the church basement stayed with Wesley long after he left that evening, Nia's question following him back to his hotel room and refusing to loosen its grip. He sat awake most of the night turning it over, unable to land on an answer that felt honest rather than convenient. By morning, he understood that whatever he decided to do next would define the shape of everything he'd spent his career building. The pressure from Chicago arrived before he'd even finished his coffee. Grace Whitfield called first, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone managing a crisis rather than living through one. She explained that the board had scheduled an emergency session to discuss what she called his unusual level of personal involvement in a single-tenant matter. She reminded him gently that Foster Meridian's legal team was already nervous about the exposure a public apology might create. Admitting fault in one case, she warned, could open the door to hundreds of similar claims across the portfolio. Wesley listened to all of it without much reaction, because none of it surprised him. His father's old lawyers had built the entire company around the assumption that sympathy was a liability, something to be managed and contained rather than acted upon. Marcus made his own position just as clear when Wesley returned to the church later that day. He told Wesley plainly that he wanted no cameras, no press statement, and no expectation that he would perform gratitude in front of an audience. Whatever changes Wesley intended to make, Marcus said, needed to apply to every family in every building, not just the one that happened to end up on the evening news. It wasn't a request. It was a condition, and Wesley accepted it without trying to negotiate it down. That same week, Wesley pulled every eviction record across all 14,000 units in the company's portfolio, staying up past 3 in the morning cross-referencing addresses, payment histories, and internal tenant notes. What emerged from the data was harder to sit with than anything Curtis Doyle had told him at the Pinnacle office. 847 families had been evicted within the past year alone, the vast majority of them long-term tenants who had simply hit one unexpected setback, an injury, a lost job, a medical bill that arrived at the wrong time. The pattern deepened the longer he looked. Buildings in predominantly black neighborhoods showed eviction rates far higher than buildings elsewhere in the portfolio, and maintenance requests in those same buildings routinely took longer to resolve. Tenants, there were far more likely to be labeled aggressive or uncooperative after filing a complaint, the same language that had been used against Marcus after nothing more than a phone call about hot water. Somewhere along the way, bias had quietly become data, and data had become policy, until the whole system looked clean enough on paper to never draw a second look. Wesley sat with that discovery in a way he hadn't sat with anything in years, aware that Marcus wasn't an exception to how the company operated. He was the outcome the company had been built to produce. The board's warnings grew sharper as word spread that Wesley was considering a pause on evictions company-wide. Directors reminded him that lenders might reconsider financing terms and investors might pull support if quarterly numbers softened even slightly. His father's voice returned to him uninvited, the same old warning about running a business on emotion instead of discipline. For the first time in his life, Wesley found himself questioning whether that warning had ever been wisdom at all. Everything came to a head one evening at the church, when Naya discovered that the box containing her mother's photographs had never made it out of the apartment during the eviction. It held nearly everything the family had left of Lena Reed, images that existed nowhere else because they had never been backed up anywhere digital. While the shelter settled into its evening routine and the adults were distracted helping other families set up cots for the night, Naya slipped out the side door alone, determined to get back to the building before the abandoned belongings were hauled away for good. She was found nearly an hour later by police officers doing a routine check near the back of the building, sitting beside the dumpsters with her bare hands turning over garbage bags one at a time, her fingers stiff from the cold. When Marcus reached her, he didn't scold her or ask why she'd left. He simply pulled her into his arms and held on, and for the first time since the eviction, his composure gave out entirely in front of Wesley. "You think we just lost an apartment?" he said, his voice breaking around the words. "That was the last place my kids still remembered their mother." Wesley understood then, standing in the cold outside a building he owned, but had never truly known, that no amount of money could restore what had actually been taken. That same night, the board notified him that an emergency vote had been scheduled to determine whether his continued interference in company policy justified removing him from his position entirely. Wesley sat alone afterward, running through everything he stood to lose. Marcus still didn't fully trust him. Nia and Caleb had been hurt in ways no apology could undo. Hundreds of other families were likely living through some version of the same nightmare, unseen and unspoken for. At 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, he called his chief operating officer and gave an order that would define everything that came after. "Freeze every eviction," he said. "No new filings, no pending removals. Not one family goes out on the street until every case has been reviewed individually." The board vote happened 3 days later, and Wesley walked into that room prepared to lose the company his father had built. What he offered instead of an apology was the data itself, laid out plainly, showing 847 families in a pattern that no responsible business could continue pretending not to see. Enough directors were unsettled by what they saw that the vote to remove him narrowly failed, though the warning in the room was unmistakable. He would be watched closely, and failure now would not be forgiven twice. With his position secured for the moment, Wesley moved forward with what mattered most first. Marcus was given back a 2-bedroom apartment in the same building on Kensington Avenue, 6 months of rent waived entirely, every late fee erased, and a clear written guarantee that none of it would ever appear on his tenant record. Wesley made a point of telling him plainly that this wasn't charity. It was restitution for what the company itself had caused. A staff member going through the discarded items in Pinnacle's storage warehouse found a water-damaged box that had been misplaced rather than destroyed. Most of what was inside had been ruined beyond saving, but one photograph had survived intact, Lena smiling with both children pressed against her sides. Wesley didn't hand it to Marcus directly. He left it on the table in the new apartment along with a short note that read simply, "Some things money can't replace." I'm sorry your family nearly lost this one. When Caleb wandered into the bedroom later and asked his father if anyone could take this home away again, Marcus knelt down to his level and answered without hesitation. Not today, he said, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure nobody ever tries again. Wesley never offered Marcus a job inside Foster Meridian, understanding correctly that it would only reinforce the exact dynamic Marcus had rejected from the beginning. Instead, he connected him with an independent attorney who helped push through the long-delayed workers' compensation claim from his injury at the depot. Marcus won the case, received the back pay he'd been owed for months, and eventually returned to work in a modified role while his hand continued healing. Within the year, his experience and steady leadership earned him a promotion to head of safety training. The changes at Foster Meridian extended far beyond one building. Wesley terminated the company's contract with Pinnacle Property Group and built an internal management division from the ground up. It now required direct, repeated contact with any tenant before an eviction could even be considered, along with a mandatory 30-day review period for anyone facing genuine hardship. Subjective labels like aggressive or uncooperative were banned from tenant files unless backed by clear, documented evidence, and every final eviction decision now passed through an independent review board rather than a single manager's judgment. Wesley also established a 90-day emergency assistance fund, an expedited repair team for urgent maintenance issues, and a tenant council with real voting power over company policy, not just a symbolic seat at the table. Marcus agreed to join that council, but only after confirming his vote would carry actual weight rather than serve as decoration for a press release. Wesley agreed without hesitation, understanding by now exactly what kind of promise Marcus needed to hear before he would believe it. 6 months later, the results were difficult to argue with. Evictions across the portfolio had dropped by 78%. Maintenance response times had fallen sharply, and tenant retention had climbed higher than it had been in years. Short-term revenue dipped slightly, just as the board had feared, but long-term stability improved in ways that quieted even the harshest critics inside the company. The gap in eviction rates between wealthier neighborhoods and lower-income ones began closing for the first time since anyone had thought to track it. Wesley had proven, against every warning his father ever gave him, that protecting people and running a profitable business were never actually opposites. The real failure had never been compassion. It had been a system that mistook indifference for professionalism. A year after the eviction that started everything, a news crew returned to 1847 Kensington Avenue. This time Marcus wasn't standing on a sidewalk beside a pile of ruined furniture. He stood inside the building's newly renovated community room, introduced now as a tenant, a father, the head of safety training at his workplace, and a voting member of the Tenant Advisory Council that had reshaped how the entire company treated the people living inside its walls. Nia sat in the front row holding the one surviving photograph of her mother, while Caleb held the small yellow toy bus, its wheel finally repaired by his father's steady hand. Marcus spoke plainly to the camera, without performance or bitterness. "A father doesn't fail just because he gets hurt and needs a little more time," he said. "A system fails when 2 hard months turn into a family losing their home on live television." In Chicago, Wesley sat alone in front of his television once again. The same room, the same table, the same address glowing on the screen in front of him. But this time, the sight of 1847 Kensington Avenue didn't leave him frozen in shame. It reminded him instead of exactly where his responsibility had always belonged. He had spent his career believing he owned buildings, contracts, and cash flow. Marcus Reed had forced him to understand that behind every address was a family simply trying to hold on to its dignity, and that the moment he finally saw that, he'd stopped being the kind of man his father raised him to be, and started becoming someone he could actually respect. If this story reminded you that real change usually starts with one person deciding to actually look, we'd love to have you back for the next one. Hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments what you'd have done in Wesley's place. See you in the next story.